probably seen some of the clips floating around about this DMT laser test, where a person who's ingested the hallucinogen DMT stares at a red laser beam pointed at a wall. This experiment has gone somewhat viral, largely because people have reported eerily similar patterns in the hallucinations produced when they focus their vision on this laser beam. Hallucinations which are said to resemble binary code or Hebrew letters in something like the visual style of the Matrix movies. Anyone familiar with hallucinogen or DMT culture is probably already aware of the machine elves, another famously common DMT-induced hallucination, where people report seeing small humanoid creatures like the elves or gnomes of European folklore, but with mechanical bodies. The fact that totally unrelated people separated by space and time have reported seeing similar or identical shapes, patterns, and beings when under the influence of DMT has led some to speculate that DMT gives its user sensory access to some separate dimension or plane of reality. And the reason that people on DMT tend to see similar visual hallucinations is because those visuals aren't hallucinations at all, but are in fact real, physical phenomena which can only be accessed through the use of hallucinogens like DMT. In this interpretation, the machine elves and the red laser binary code are as real as anything else, but some property of our consciousness or visual system just prevents us from seeing them under normal conditions. But there is another interpretation. What if our hallucinations were similar not because they pointed to some external physical reality, but rather because those hallucinations are culturally mediated, and people within the same cultures tend to draw even their hallucinations from a shared psychological reality? So, in the early 1800s, a man living in London named James Tilly Matthews became convinced that a gang of scientifically skilled criminals and spies had installed a massive mechanical device on a section of the London Wall, which they were using to psychologically torment Matthews. Matthews believed this device, which he had named the Loom, was able to emit invisible rays, generate gaseous charges, and manipulate magnetic fields from afar without detection. He reported a sensation he called lobster cracking, where the Loom produced a magnetic field which was able to stop the circulation of his blood, as well as apoplexy working with the nutmeg grater, in which the Loom supposedly introduced fluids into his skull. Matthews even developed a cast of characters who he believed was using the Loom against him, with names like the Middleman and the Glove Woman. Suspecting that the gang was using the Loom to read minds and plant thoughts into people's heads for espionage purposes, Matthews came to believe that other competing gangs all over London were using their own Looms against each other and on unsuspecting civilians in a grand struggle for power. Matthews spent his life in and out of mental hospitals and asylums in London, and the only reason we know about his Loom in such detail is because Matthews himself and his doctors took copious notes during his treatment. It isn't known for sure what Matthews' exact diagnosis was, but the Loom story falls squarely into the category of thoughts that psychologists call persecutory delusions, which are a typical feature of schizophrenia. Matthews' Loom hallucinations were occurring in the early 1800s in the midst of the Industrial Revolution in London. The physical mechanisms the Loom used to torment Matthews, electrical charges, gaseous vapors, invisible rays, would have seemed like the very cutting edge of high technology to a working-class Londoner of that era, just a few steps beyond the technology with which Matthews would have been familiar. Of course, in reality, there was no espionage gang in the London Wall stopping Matthews' blood flow with an Loom. Instead, Matthews was likely experiencing symptoms of mental illness like intrusive, unpleasant thoughts, auditory hallucinations, body horror like medical hallucinations, and so on, for which he could find no mundane cause. And instead of accepting that the voices were coming from inside his head, Matthews constructed a more satisfying explanation, which was subconsciously shaped by the culture and technology that surrounded him. The creation of elaborately detailed fantasies to explain psychiatric symptoms has been extremely common among people with certain mental illnesses throughout history. The only thing that changes is the types of fantasies they come up with. People who have auditory hallucinations, like hearing voices, for example, will often develop elaborate rationalizations to give their symptoms an external cause that better conforms to their understanding of the world. In modern, industrialized or post-industrial Western countries, voice hearers usually blame the voices in their head on malicious actors using advanced technology, like the CIA or MI5 using so-called voice-to-skull technology to beam audio into their brains, or some kind of biotech implant from the military or even technologically advanced aliens. In one case, an American man began hearing voices in his head in his young adulthood, which always sounded like a group of slightly drunk men sitting around a table, observing his behavior, and making derogatory, embarrassing comments about him. The man came to believe the CIA was watching him at all times through advanced surveillance systems and feeding real-time information about his life to this group of men, all CIA agents, whose commentary was then being beamed directly into his brain so he could hear all the degrading things they said about him. He ultimately concluded that an offhand derogatory remark he'd made about former CIA Director George H.W. Bush in the 1980s had somehow made it back to the CIA, and this was their way of getting revenge on him. In contrast, in less developed, pre-industrial societies, voice hearers typically believe the voices in their head come from angels, demons, or gods, or some other supernatural cause that fits into their particular culture and worldview. In fact, there are some regions of Asia and Africa in which the voices people hallucinate aren't even negative, but rather just give the voice hearer random compliments or advice. Whereas for modern Western voice hearers, the voices in their heads are usually mean, taunting, or even violent. We also see this two steps ahead technology phenomenon in things like UFO sightings. Back in the 1950s and 60s, around the time of the first Apollo missions and the moon landings, the craft in UFO reports often featured design elements like portholes and landing gears, which at the time would have seemed like highly advanced technology to the average American. In the famous 1964 UFO landing case in Socorro, New Mexico, the primary witness, Lonnie Zamora, claimed that he'd seen a group of small, humanoid figures enter a large, white, almost egg-shaped UFO a few yards in front of him, which took off vertically and disappeared. When investigators searched the site of the alleged landing, they even found landing gear impressions in the ground, exactly where Zamora said they'd be. But if you look at more recent UFO sightings, like the famous Tic Tac UFO seen by the USS Nimitz crew, witnesses virtually never report seeing craft with portholes or landing gears anymore. Rather, the ships are typically smooth with no rivets, seams, or windows, and instead of landing on retractable landing gears, the new designs just hover above the ground without the need to make direct physical contact. Another common feature among those who claim to have seen actual aliens during space-age UFO encounters was that the alien beings were usually said to have been wearing fishbowl helmets or other protective equipment resembling something like a scuba suit. In contrast, the typical alien creature reported in the last 30 or 40 years wears something closer to a Star Trek uniform, or sometimes nothing at all. Is it really plausible that an alien race technologically capable of visiting Earth from distant galaxies would tailor their spacecraft and clothing so as to appear only a few steps ahead of the technology available to humans at the time of their visit? Why would the aliens visiting 1960s America choose to use spaceships that looked like a 1960s American's idea of future technology? Are the aliens just trying to not freak us out too bad or something? This is not to say that UFO sightings are hallucinations exactly, but the same principle seems to apply. Our perceptions appear to be mediated or limited by what we expect and believe to be possible. If you believe in a spiritual world full of demons and energies, then the idea that a demon might speak directly into your mind in a way that no one else can hear is entirely plausible. If you believe you live in an ordered, material world of atoms and discrete forces, then a CIA voice-to-skull weapon is plausible in a way that talking demons are not. Belief and knowledge can even change what we actually see in a literal sense, and this has been demonstrated experimentally. In one study, a researcher holds up the front page of a newspaper 20 feet or so away from the participant, far enough away that the participant can't read the headline. Once they've verified that the participant can't decipher the words, the researcher tells him what the headline says, and suddenly, the participant can now see the letters of the headline and even read it, clear as day. The participant's eyes aren't being made any stronger by being told what the headline says, and the font size of the newspaper certainly isn't increasing, but the mere fact of knowing what you're looking for allows you to see things which would otherwise be invisible. So what does this mean for the DMT laser experiment? It's hard to say, but within the context of American culture, strange hieroglyphics, binary code, and the Matrix aesthetic communicate a slightly futuristic alien vibe that has distinct precedence in our shared visual culture. If you really want to test this theory, get some Bedouin tribesmen or South Asian Buddhists to smoke some DMT and stare at a laser and find out what they see. Because I have a feeling that if we did that, instead of machine elves and Matrix binary code, we might start hearing about DMT jinn spirits or DMT orang banyan, and everyone knows those couldn't possibly be real.